So I am Scott Dworkin. I am based in the Los Angeles area, a little north of Los Angeles in Ventura County. I have been in aviation. I'm a little bit of a wear a different hat depending on the day, photographer. So I started out I started out as a hobbyist, like a lot of people did. The short version of my story is I grew up wanting to be a pilot myself in the military. Was going to air shows from a very young age. My parents took me to air shows, and it became sort of my thing. And like a lot of people of my age group, when Top Gun came out, the first Top Gun, I have to say that because there was never going to be a sequel. Um, the first Top Gun came out, that sort of fueled the fire even more. So I
Sure.
kind of honed in on I want to be a naval aviator now. And when I have no family with a military background, my uncle was in the Air Force very briefly in the 50s. Really no military background with my family. And so when I graduated high school, I went to college in San Diego, and obviously I really never wanted to go to one of the service academies. I didn't have the grades anyway, but it was kind of because of the fact that I had no military background. I knew what I wanted to do, but was kind of like the deal with my parents too was go to college. There's ROTC, there's officer OCS or OTS, depending on the service branch, which is after college, you get a commission. You know, I kind of made that deal with them that I would go to San Diego, start school, see what it was about, see what how hard it was to, study and do things like that. But after my first year at San Diego State, I kind of said, okay, I still want to do this. And I walked over to the Navy, and they have an ROTC detachment in San Diego. And I said, this is what I want to do. And they said no. I was in school in 92, 93. I graduated high school in 1991. So I went to San Diego 92, and that was after the first Gulf War had ended.
Mm,
So there was no, and I've told the story on a couple other podcasts, but it kind of creates the narrative that there was no plan for any more wars. There never is. So, Second Gulf War hadn't happened, everything was hunky dory, and the military kind of looked at that and was in a drawdown phase. And so at that point, the various, at least the Navy at that point, they had been inundated in the late 80s with pilot cadets and candidates and people wanting to be aviators. And they were just flat out saying no.
wow.
Unless you were at the Naval Academy with an engineering type of degree and a high grade point average, we're not even taking anybody into these other programs because we don't want to have them go through it and then find out there's no pilot slots available for you. And at that point, they were, um, pilot guys who were qualifying to be pilots who were getting their commission in the Navy were being what they call stashed away. They were sitting at desks for a long time with the hope that a slot would open up in training. So they just said no to me. And so then the commander that I met at the time was like, why don't you go talk to the Air Force? Because they fly more airplanes, they have a much broader range of aircraft, and you might have a better chance. So I did that. And I went talk to the Air Force, and they kind of said the same thing, but they said, but we'll take you in the program. We're not going to say no, because their attitude was, we also need officers in the Air
Right.
Force, not just pilots. The Air Force is made up of a lot of different jobs. So they said, it's a gamble, but we'll take you. And so I did that, and went through the program. And I was in a different timeline because I should have joined as a freshman, but I didn't. So they sort of accelerated everything. But long story short, I got to a point where they came to me and said, it's time to sign the dotted line.
Mm,
And part of ROTC, for a lot of people listening, like, there are ROTC scholarships and things like that where they're providing money for tuition, and then you're sort of committed. I
mhm.
didn't have any of that. I just walked in there of my own volition. I got a uniform, I got some books, I was required to take military classes along with my regular classes, and then also, one day a week of, like, marching and doing that stuff. And so I had really nothing. It was just no commitment to them other than hope. And they came to me and said, listen, we need you to sign because you've missed the first year and we're kind of rushing you through. And the next summer, you're going to have to go to basic training and we need a commitment. And the colonel that was running our detachment at the time said, listen, but I'm going to be honest with you. I do not think you're going to get a pilot slot. There's just not that many. And they're really only
Right.
going to the academy. And the few that are sprinkled around are going to go to our engineering students with 4.0 degrees. And you have a psychology major with a B average, just the reality. So the nice thing about it was at the time he thought, I'd grown up with this passion. I had airplane pictures on my wall as a kid. I had model kits, that I was that guy. We went to Luke Air Force Base as a group, as a ROTC group, and he picked 10 cadets to get to fly in F-16s. Now, normally that only went to people who were commissioned, like had taken scholarship money, had already signed the paperwork, were going in. I was the only one that he picked that wasn't. It was just because he felt partly, you're not going to get to do this. I think it was like sympathy, like I want you to at least once see what it was like, and then partly because he thought it would motivate me to stay in and take the chance. And I did
Right.
it, and I just decided not to stay. It wasn't anything, I didn't take it. I didn't know that until after he told me after why he did it. And he kind of came to me the week after we got back from Arizona from this trip and said, I did this for a reason, and I hope you will stay because whether you're a pilot or not, you're the type of person that I would like to have as a leader in the Air Force. But he said,
Nice.
I need you to go, go home, talk to your parents. Here's the type of list of jobs you could get as a commissioned officer, and maybe at some point you can make a transition into aviation. Here's some jobs where you would wear a flight suit to work every day if that's what it's about for you, which it wasn't. It wasn't about the look. And I went home and talked to my parents and said, it was never, and I know I had no disrespect to anybody that did this for these reasons, but it was never about joining the military for the sake of that. I wanted to be a pilot. And
Right.
so I
That
kind of
was the
said,
path.
yeah. So I have friends that are in the military that joined because of post 9/11 and the love of country and all these different things. For me, this was my goal, it wasn't going to happen. So I walked away and turned in my uniform books and walked away and graduated college and went into the real world. And before that, as I mentioned, I had gone to air shows as a kid. I had my mom's film camera, took crappy photos at the air shows that now I look at the little, used to take them to the photo mat or whatever back in the old days, little 4x6s. And when I gave up that dream, um, for better or for worse, I sort of walked away from all of it.
Mm.
And I went to work in marketing research for a few years. I was an intern when I moved back to Los Angeles. I was an intern at a marketing research firm and then got a job there after college. And did that for a few years. And my dad has been in the textile industry for now going on 50 some odd years, but at the time, for many years. He had left a company that he was the vice president of, started his own business. And again, growing up wanting to be maverick, you know, um, every time he would like talk to me about his work, it was like, hey, we live a great life and you've provided for us well, but it's not something I would ever want to do. When I left the marketing research job and started looking for other jobs, he came to me and said, hey, Scott, listen, I have my own business. It's just me. I'm going to offer you one more time. Spend 3 months with me, go out in the car with me, see what it's about. And I was like, at that point, having spent a little time in the real world, I was like, gift horse, I got to be realistic here. And so I went out with him and I started working with him. And during that time, my parent, I think I had started dating my wife, but I know my wife now. But at the time, even my parents and she, both of them were like, it's very strange that you had this passion from like 5 years old, literally, model kits and the whole, you name it. And because you couldn't do this, you took all of that. And I literally, it was like somebody died and I never dealt with it. I just put it in a
Mm.
box and put it in storage, like literally.
Yep. Hmm.
All the photo albums, everything went into storage. And, my parents had said it a few, it's like kind of unhealthy, but also, it's a little strange. And I said, yeah, but this is just who I am. If I can't do what I wanted to do, why would I want to be around this? But they sort of made me realize that maybe wasn't the right way to go at it. And then my wife, girlfriend at the time, said the same thing. And there were happened to be an air show coming up at Point Magoo, which is down the street from where I live now. And that's the one I grew up going to. And I thought, you know what, I'll go. Why not? And my mom, again, they had always had a camera in the house, so I took their digital camera, and as soon as I got to the air show, it was like, click, like, it just came all flooding back, and I'm like, "You know what? This is still something I enjoy." I mean, I'm the guy that, like, if an airplane's flying over, I'm like this still, even
Mm.
at my age. Like, helicopter flies over, I run outside to see what it is. So, I
Good
got
stuff.
there, and over time, I started going to a few more air shows, and this is now digital cameras had come out, obviously, in that time frame, and I started, you know, seeing the things that I used to hate about it when I was younger going to air shows was you have to show up super early. There's throngs of people there. You're in the crowd, you're shooting the back of heads to
Mm.
get good shots. You can't kind of weasel your way to the front. And for better or for worse, air shows, by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, people have had a few beers, they get obnoxious, they're spilling beers everywhere. And I'm just like, uh-uh, I don't like like I want to be in the front. So I started noticing when I would go to these shows that there was like a media tent, and it was always at the front. And I started talking to the other photographers, like, how do you get here? Like, how do you get in the front? Well, you have to be credentialed. So again, shortened version of all this was I was the guy that would just start asking questions. And
Nice.
I would, again, I started making friends with some of these photographers, and there were a couple websites at the time where people would post their photos. Yeah, this was a little bit pre-Facebook even, but there were two aviation websites that were pretty well known, and people would post their photos and either critique them or just show off, show them off and say, I was at the show, I went to this place. Um, and I joined one of the groups and met a bunch of cool guys, and we started going to the shows together, or meeting up at the shows together. And through that affiliation, we were invited to a couple. Not the goal for all aviation photographers is not an air show, right? Real
Mm.
world. You want to be invited
Right.
to the base and sit on the side of the runway when they're really working, not doing a demo. That's kind of the thing. And we got invited to a couple of things like training type of events where we were allowed to go out. One was in El Centro, which is south of here, and then the Coast Guard found out about us, and in some of their training events, they said, "Hey, listen, we need good photos. We need good photos to hang in the hangar, in the hallways of our offices, and if you guys would come out and share your photos with us, we'll, open the gate and let you out to the training area that we're gonna use, which is on this cliffside in Palos Verdes by the water. They do, hoist training.
Nice.
Um, so again, during the time that I was meeting all these photographers and understanding how to get the media access, I also started remembering that the books that I had on my bookshelf growing up and the books that I started buying again in my 20s and the magazines that I started buying again, I would read all the articles and look at the photographers and understand that these were civilian names. It wasn't,
Mhm.
Lieutenant so and so took the photo. Some of them were. A lot of the articles will say US Navy photo or something like that. I started seeing the same names over and over again. And it was a lot of the same names that I grew up reading. And
Mhm.
so when I would now go to the air shows, I was very strategic and I would talk to the pilots and I would say, hey, I know your sister squadron did this. How? How did this happen? How did that guy get to fly in this helicopter or this aircraft? And a lot of the pilots would say, "Oh, we don't know, but give me your email or your phone number, and we'll find out." Because I was expressing to them my background, and the weird thing was, and it wasn't to be any like I didn't consider myself different, but the fact that I had that one F-16 flight in Arizona to a lot of the photographers, it was like, "Whoa, we wanna know what it's like too," and you had that chance, but to a lot of the military guys, they're like, "Look, you tried, a lot of people don't get to do it, but you tried and you're still here and you're still enthusiastic," so they were kinda receptive to my conversations,
Nice.
and so, a handful of them would be like, "Hey, give me your phone number, we'll find out." It was the Coast Guard that really was the one that when we were out at one of these training events, they were hot seating the helicopter so pilots would get multiple evolutions in this training. And one of the pilots, when he was sitting there and we were literally sitting at a table eating lunch together, I said, Lieutenant, like, I've seen photos of Coast Guard Los Angeles helicopters in this magazine. How did that happen? The photographer is part of our group. How did that happen? And he said, well, I happen to also be the collateral, which means like the pilots will have other jobs in the squadron. He was the collateral public affairs officer. So it was
Mm,
like, I know how it happened. And I said,
nice.
really? So that was like door open. And at the same time, um, the Ventura County Sheriff's Department and Fire Department, they have a joint helicopter unit. They do law enforcement and fire. They had put out a fire in the hills behind my house, and I had trudged out there to the corner of my street and took some photos of them dropping water. And their facility is 20 minutes from my house, and I went and enlarged a couple of the photos and knocked on their hangar door. And one of the guys in the flight suit answered, and I said, "Hey, listen, I live in Lang Ranch in Thousand Oaks. Thanks for saving our neighborhood. I made these posters for you guys. This was you dropping water on the fire." And he's like, "Cool, this is great, thank you." And he's like, "You want to see our hangar?" And I said, "Sure." And I did the same thing to him. I said, "Listen, do you guys ever fly? I want to do something with this. I'm back into photography. I buy these magazines. Like, how does this happen?" And he said, he said, "Well, listen, we don't fly people on our helicopter. We don't fly civilians on our helicopters. I mean, it's not something we do. However, I can introduce you to our captain, and you can tell him what your goals are." And so at the same time that this Coast Guard thing had happened, this Ventura County thing had happened. And he introduced me and he walked me into the captain's office and said, "Hey, Scott knocked on our door. He brought us these posters, which is nice. Um, Tell him what you want to tell him." And I said, "Hey, sir, listen, this is, I want to get into these magazines. And I don't know what to do. I mean, I'm literally asking." And he said, "Well, listen, here's the bottom line. I can't just fly you on a helicopter because you want to take photos. I mean, as much as we appreciate great photos, I can't just do that. Nobody will approve that. What I can tell you is as a sheriff's law enforcement and fire department air unit, we have one of the biggest line item budget, one of the biggest items in the line item budget for the county every year.
Mm,
And when I have to go and ask for something from the Ventura County Board of Supervisors, um, they know I'm the captain of the air unit, and they're going to say, "Well, of course you want the newest computer. You want this. You want." He wasn't even buying helicopters at the time. It was like equipment. And he said, as crazy as this sounds, there are three or four publications that are in the helicopter business that if a civilian writes the article, I take that with me and I can present it as a non-biased opinion. And I show that to the politicians in a sense and say, "Hey, why don't you read this? It explains what we do and it helps." Every little bit helps me get my mission accomplished. So he's like, the bottom line here is if you can write an article for one of these magazines, I can fly you and I can get that approved, but I can't just take you in the helicopter to take photos. And he said, "Listen, I appreciate the fact that you spent your own money to blow up these photos and have them framed for us. So I'm going to do you a favor." And he wrote down three magazines and he slid it across his desk and he said, "You get in one of these magazines and I will fly you." And I went home that day and I emailed all three. Like, just
that's
that's who I
awesome.
am. And the first one that replied, she was like, "Send me some of the photos you've taken at air shows and just send me something." I sent her a few photos. She's like, "The photos are fine. I need 1,200 words. We haven't worked with Ventura County in years, so that's great. I need 1,200 words by this date." And I drove back over to Camarillo a couple days later, knocked on the door again. I said, "Hey, Captain, Airbeat magazine." He goes, "You want to go right now?" I mean, literally, he's like, "Do you want to go fly right now?" And I said, "I don't have my camera." And he goes, "Then tell me when you want to go. That's all you, most people," he said, "would have run for the hills at this point, and you didn't." So then I
Nice.
went back and I emailed the lieutenant from the Coast Guard. I said, "Hey, do you know what Airbeat magazine is?" He goes, "No." I said, "Well, it's a law enforcement association. It's a foundation basically, AELA." And I had emailed the editor back and I said, "Do you have any interest in the Coast Guard? I mean, I know it's law enforcement foundation or publication," but she goes, "Oh, we do a search and rescue specific issue every fall. You can get in with the Coast Guard?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And she goes, "Give me 1,200 words." So I went to the
Wow.
lieutenant and I said, "Hey, listen, Airbeat." He goes, "I don't care what it is. I told you if you get me published, we can get it approved by the Coast Guard." And he's like, literally says, "Say that you want to come next week." And I'm like, so that's how I started. I mean, and I always understood this, that what I saw in these magazines with the guys that I respected and looked up to was a lot of, the fighter jet stuff. And I knew
Mhm.
going into this, like, there's no way that I'm then going to go from this to this right away. So I built into it and I started looking at other military units, what you don't see typically in the magazines. You don't see a lot of airlift, air refueling, transport, things like that. It can't all be, as much as I love my fighter pilot buddies, it's like they don't need that much press. They they get it. So at the same time, I was working with my dad. So I started doing that with him. And as I started figuring it out and meeting more pilots and getting help, I explained to my dad, like, when I put in a request and I started working with a publication mostly out of the UK. So the editor and I got along great, and I started traveling and doing all these military units. But when you would put in a request with the military to do this, and then also because I was asking to fly, it's a lot more uh logistical, and they always say no. I mean, they just say no. But then once we got through those hoops, um, it could take them 6 months to get the approval. So my dad's deal was
Mhm.
like, "Listen, I know this is what you love. So as long as you're working when you're working, that's fine. But if
Nice.
when these approvals are out and all of a sudden they say you're approved, can you come in 2 weeks? Go do it. Right? Go do it." And at the same
Nice.
time, the other thing with photography that I was doing is, I was never, and I don't mean this to sound weird, but, like, I was never into photography just because of photography. I was doing photography that I liked the subject matter. So for me,
Right.
aviation was number 1, number 2 was cycling, and number 3 was music. I've always been into music. I'm kind of a hard rock, heavy metal guy. So I'm like, "You know what? Same thing." I go to the bike races with my buddies, and I see photographers there, so I started asking them, like, "How do and the cycling organization in Thousand Oaks found out that I was at all these races, and they asked me to become their photographer, and that 14 years later is now I'm running the whole team. I don't even do photography anymore. I run the whole, like, organization from a financial standpoint. I do all the social media and marketing for the team, budget. So I don't know how that happened, but so I started doing cycling, and it was coincided with the around time of Lance Armstrong. So cycling in the United States was pretty popular. And because of our affiliation of our team was with Amgen, Amgen was the primary sponsor of the Tour of California for years, which was the pro race, one of the biggest pro races in the United States at the time. So because of that affiliation with our team with Amgen, we were invited to go to the Tour of California and shadow the pro racers to represent a cancer part of what Amgen, as a
Right.
pharmaceutical
Mhm.
company called Breakaway from Cancer. Patrick Dempsey was their
Right.
spokesman for many years, and so I was fortunate enough to be able to hang out with Lance Armstrong. Maybe I shouldn't use him. Other professional cyclists around that time. And so then the magazine started finding that out. And I started doing work on the cycling publication side. I started reviewing product occasionally because I was also riding my bike. So if they sent me a helmet, I would ride and wear it and write a short little review. At the time, unfortunately, because of the way the industry was, to my wife's chagrin, they would pay me in the helmet, meaning,
Mm.
like, the payment was the helmet, which I love, but my wife's like, "We can't pay the bills with shoes and helmets and bike jerseys," but okay. But it was all local, so and then the 3rd one was music. I was really into music. I was going to concerts from the time I was a little kid, and I kinda thought the same thing. I'd show up at these concerts, And I would see in the front row, there would be photographers there with these lenses. And I go, well, how does that happen? And I'm the guy that, as crazy as it sounds, I would pick a band that I liked and I would do an hour's worth of research on Google and say, like, who's their publicist? Who's their, because I went to a couple of magazines and the magazines were like, we don't know you, so we're not going to hire you. But understood, they were kind enough to at least fill me in that in the music world, in the live music world especially, the way you get the access to the concerts is you have to get published. You have to
Right.
be there. The bands and the band's managers and publicists want the publicity for their band in being in LA on a tour. So like there's at the time there were a lot of web-based publications. This wasn't like I was going after Rolling Stone. Most of the live music reviews, like a band comes into LA and plays at the crypto.com center, Staples
Hmm.
Center. I still call it Staples Center. The band might be the biggest band in the world, like Metallica, but they still want coverage.
Right.
So
Of course.
the publicist is like, hey, we need a review of the show. And, we want photos, but we're not just going to let you in. So I said, okay, again, I don't know what to do with this information because I don't know any of these publications, but I found a few online music publications. And I said, hey, if I can get into, and it sounds crazy too, because like one of the first bands was, I grew up loving Motley Crue. And I literally saw that they were playing at the Hollywood Bowl. And I found out who their manager was. And just through, I guess, digging, sleuthing, whatever you want to call it, I found his email. And I emailed him and I said, listen, I really want to shoot your guys, and I grew up loving them, and a couple of the guys lived near me when I was growing up. I used to see them all the time when I was in high school, and it's like I feel a kinship to this. And and he literally replied back to me, how did you get my email? The guy's the manager of Motley Crue. He's been their manager for decades. And I said, I found it. And he's literally wrote me back and he said, listen, I can't let you in to shoot the band just for the sake of taking photos for your own portfolio, right? It's just not something we do. But again,
Right.
he said the same thing. He goes, because you were perseverant and you figured out how to get in touch with me, I will let you, I will give you media passes or press passes if you can find a magazine to put them in. So I just went to one of those online ones that I had been following. And I said, hey, listen, if I can get in a Motley Crue at the Hollywood Bowl. And the guy replied, the editor was like, yeah, do it. So I emailed this guy back and I said, this is the magazine. He goes, done. So, I mean, it was
Awesome.
the same. So those three things were the things that I sort of tracked while I was working in my dad's business. And I worked with my dad for 15 years. Um, to kind of round out the background part, what had happened was after 9/11, my dad's the textile business of my dad is hospitality. So it's hotels, restaurants. It's not residential textiles. We were making and selling fabric for hotels. After
Right.
9/11, right?
Wow.
Literally within 2 days, we knew the industry was going to stop. Nobody was going to travel. And
Hmm.
then once the flying started again, the fear of traveling lasted, right? So his business started to slow down dramatically. And he kept saying to me, listen, I mean, at some point, I hope one of these three things you're doing turns into a job because I don't know how much longer I can keep you,
Wow.
and so it was, a crappy situation, but it's a family business. And that my wife worked for him at the time too, and they had to let her go. And that's when she
Mm.
got into real estate. But I understood that. He said, and the decision point was when my wife was let go, it was like, hey, he's out selling. I need him, and then Scott can come back to the office and do the stuff in the office if we need that too, but I need him out selling. But there was a
Right.
point where he said, listen, it's getting dicey. And it just happened to be that one of these jobs that I was working on with the military that got approved, um, turned into me going out to Edwards Air Force Base, which I had grown up going to all the air shows every year that they had an air show. I went there. The goal of this trip, by the way, was so originally in one of the projects I did, which take a quick step back, one of the projects I did with the Air Force, I went to Afghanistan as an embedded journalist with
Wow.
folks out of March Air Reserve Base, Air Force Base, but it's Air Reserve Base. I flew with them to Germany and covered their aeromedical evacuation. They turned the airplane into a flying hospital, basically. And because I had done a smaller project with the Air Force Reserve, and again, at the time, Air Force Reserve, Air National Guard, even today, somewhat misunderstood that, it's the weekend warrior thing. There are components of both that they're full time, right? So the Air Force Reserve was looking at me and they knew I was pro Air Force because of my background. And the folks out in Riverside said, listen, we love what you do and we love your enthusiasm and we'd like you to come back. And I got a call from their public affairs person one day and said, the general would like to know if you'd want to go to Afghanistan. And I literally
Wow.
was like, what? So I had to obviously run that by my family and it was a big deal. But from that trip, the same general had asked me to cover their other unit, which is their air refueling aircraft, the tanker unit. And he said, I want to do the same thing though, not Afghanistan, but you've already flown with us around Southern California. I need you to spend a week with our guys and gals to see what we really do when we are asked to go support something, which is what I did in Afghanistan. So he said, I would like you to be an embedded journalist with our KC 135 tanker unit, and we will find a place for you to go. And it's going to take a while to get it approved. But again, as long as you say yes, I'll get it approved. So, a few months later, the public affairs officer calls me up and she said, everything's approved. We're sending you to Edwards. But I said, wait a second, Linda, not only is that an hour and a half from my house, I grew up there. I wanted to go to like England or Japan or Hawaii even. You guys go on these deployments. Why are you sending me to the place that's right down the street? That's where they're sending you. We're supporting F-35. So, in the early days of F-35, they would send tankers out there to support the program, the test program. And I told her, I said, Edwards is a test base. A lot of stuff out there they don't want photos of. Are you sure? Yes, yes, it's all approved. So anyway, I went out there for this project. I spent a week out there. And of course, there was a lot of resistance to me being there in the first place as a civilian photographer journalist
Mm.
at this base, at the test base. And Lockheed still had a lot of control over the program. And Lockheed, when they found out that there was going to be a civilian in the back of this tanker shooting their airplane refueling, was like, oh, hell no. But we had to
Wow.
kind of I was literally there in the morning and I was listening to them argue about it with me there, like standing there. And they're like, he's not going. This was not, we never knew about this. The Air Force kind of ran with this and approved it, but the Air Force Reserve did, but the active duty Air Force didn't. And there was all this hand wringing. And I said, guys, listen, I'm here. Okay. I got a hotel. I'm here. You fight amongst yourselves. You tell me what you want me to do. I'm not trying to cause anybody problems. And so the deal that they made was the Lockheed photographers, their full-time photographers, had to review my photos every day at the end of the day while I was there. So over the course of the week that I was there, the photographer that was flying and their photographers fly in the back of the jets and do photo chase and all the test stuff. The photographer and I would meet every afternoon. He would look at the back of my camera and say, these are fine, or delete this or whatever. And towards the end of the week, we just over chatting. He said, "Hey, listen," because I was telling him kind of what I'm telling you, the background. And he said, "Have you ever thought of doing this as a job?" And I said, "What does that mean? I don't even know what that means. A job. I have a job. I'm a part-time photojournalist." And he's like, "No, no. There are jobs that are civilian jobs." And he goes, "I work for Lockheed full time as an aerial photographer and I was trained to fly and do all this stuff." And I said, "Oh, so you mean for Lockheed?" He goes, "No, no, we don't have a job available, but the Air Force has a contract and one of the contractors literally is leaving right now. He gave his notice. Would you should think about this with the you've already had experience at this point flying and taking photos and like you love this." And I said, "Well, okay. I don't know what to do with that. I work for my dad." But okay. And the next day, again, just all happenstance and circumstances that I put myself in. The the head of the U.S. Air Force Test Pilot School, which is at Edwards, very famous, right? All the astronauts went there. A lot of people know about TPS. The head of the test pilot school was a guy that I had met years ago at an air show, and he was now the colonel in charge of the whole test pilot school. And I knew he was there, and I said, the Friday before I leave, I'm going to stop in and see him and just say hi and see if he remembers me. Walked in, said, "Hey," and of course, whether he remembered me or not, he called me in his giant office and we sat there and chatted, and I was telling him what I was doing, and he was like, "Wow, you know what?" He goes, "You're the type of person that needs to be telling our story." 'Cause,
Nice.
public affairs within the military does their job, and that's kind of internal. But external positive public positive press for the military, the only time the press comes calling is when bad things happen,
Right.
typically, right?
100%.
Right. So he's like, "But you have this passion and you love this." He goes, "Have you ever thought of doing this as a job?" And I'm like, "What do you mean?" And he goes, "Well, there's a job on the base that just opened." And I said, "Well, the guy from Lockheed told me this yesterday." And I was like, it all like, I said, "Okay, yeah, he told me this last night." And he goes, "Right, because out my window in the next building over, there's a flight test aerial photography shop. I think you should go walk over there and introduce yourself to them." And I thought, okay, whatever. Again, finished my work for the week and I was driving home, the 2-hour drive home. And I was like, "You know what? No, I'm gonna go." I turned around, I went to the office, I walked in, and the guy that I met, who I'm still friends with to this day, um, you know, introduced myself to him, sat and chatted with him, and he was like, "The boss isn't here. She's out flying, but you are perfect." And
Nice.
literally the guy that was leaving when I walked in the office was in his cubicle because I said, "Hey, I heard there's a job available." And I start talking to this one guy, and this head pops up and he goes, "Yeah, that's my job." I'm literally like, my last day is like this week. And he and I are still friends to this day. But it was just like, so I talked to him and he said, "Listen, most of the photographers that have been hired in this job over the last, since it used to be a military job, then it went to a government job, now it's a contractor job. Most of the people that are hired have not even any experience like you do with military aircraft, telling the story, whatever. You know, I think you should talk to the boss, but she's out flying. Give me your card and I'll tell her you stopped by." And again, this was on a Friday. And I said, "Great." And I literally got in the car and started driving off. And Edwards, for people who aren't familiar, when you're on the base, it's like 20 miles to get back to the highway.
Mm,
It's a long 2-lane
yeah.
highway in the middle of nowhere. And I got halfway down the road again, and I'm like, "This is not who I am. This is not who I am." I turned around. There's a Starbucks on the base. I drove back to the Starbucks. I texted Christian, the guy that was in the office, and I said, "Hey, I decided to hang out until she comes back." And he said, "I think that's a good idea." He said, "I
Nice.
will call you when she lands from her flight that she's on," because she was out doing a test thing. And you should just come back. And I'll just kind of make it like you just popped in and left your card, that we didn't even talk. Because I want her to hear your story like from scratch. I'm not going to tell her anything. And I did that. And he called me and I went in there and I introduced myself and started chatting with her. And an hour later, she's like, "Can you stay here?" And I said, "Yeah." Called my wife. I said, "I'm not going to be home till late." Her husband used to also do this job. He still worked at Edwards. He's in public affairs. She calls him up and says, "You need to come down here now. You need to come
Mhm.
meet this guy now." We just literally, like a gift horse just showed up at our door.
Wow.
So because of the contract and the way the laws are, like, it wasn't like she could hire me. She's like, "You need to apply for this job. I will put in my 2 cents, but please apply like Monday." And it took a couple months. I had to go through all the proper procedures, but I
Oops.
got
Yep.
hired. And I told my dad, "I'm out." That was what he was waiting for. It was like, go do this." And worked out well for both of us at the time. At the same token, I live in Thousand Oaks. It's 105-ish miles door to door each way. My wife was not willing to leave and move to Palmdale or Lancaster at the time because this just came out of nowhere. And so I drove every day. I
Wow.
commuted 220-ish miles a day, to work, and I would drive from my house at 5 in the morning to get there at about 7:30. Sometimes I would, like, literally get there, get my flight suit on, and go fly in a jet and be wrecked, just exhausted, sleep on the couch in the back at lunchtime, edit the video and photos, whatever it is I had to do, and then drive home, and then wake up the next day and do it. I did it for about a year, and I was exhausted.
For
And we
sure.
weren't gonna move. So there was a few other reasons as well, but like for that and a couple other reasons, after about a year or so, I was like, you know what? I could stay here. It's gonna kill me, and it's also, my boss at the time, she moved on from that job now, but at the time she wasn't going. There was no promotion. There was no. It was just sort of, this is where you are. I can keep doing this. It's a once in a lifetime job opportunity, but I had to be realistic with myself. And when I decided to leave, I had become very close friends with my Air Force boss. Although I was a contractor, we were in a squadron. So the colonel that ran this squadron was he was a cyclist. We bonded over that. We were hanging out all the time. And then one of my Navy friends who I had done some work with prior to getting the full-time job as a photojournalist, he and I became close. And both of them were like, "So now you're gone. Now you're leaving. What are you going to do?" And my dad's like, "Well, I can't hire you back." So I was faced with this reality of, what am I going to do? And both of these guys said, "Listen, you were able for 6 or 7 years to successfully navigate this through your own hard work and perseverance and treating it like it should be a business, professional. Yes, you love aviation, yes, you love photography, but you always treated it like a business.
Mhm.
And you were able to land this job, but also for the prior to that, get these opportunities, Afghanistan, flying on an aircraft carrier, whatever. Why are you not going to do this?" And I said, "Well, I don't even know what that means." Again, it was one of those situations. They're like, "You should just start your own business." And I thought, well, okay. So I reached out. By that point, there were a couple colleagues of mine that had done this. And I kind of said, like, "What do you think?" And they're like, "Look, where we are now in 2015, social media had started picking up, right? A lot of the way things had been done over the last decades had changed dramatically with social media. So those other colleagues of mine that I respect were like, look it, you want to play this game where, the companies that were licensing photos back when know they can go on Facebook now and hit up a photographer that posts something and say, can we use your photo? And they'll give it away for free. So they were like, we're experiencing this now. We don't know if there's a viable business anymore because aviation is already a niche as it is, but
Right.
sure, go for it. So one of these guys that was like really well known, had published a bunch of books. He ended up taking a full-time job doing flight tests for the Navy on the East Coast. So he came to LA for something else. We had dinner and he's like, "Scott, if you want to run with this, I'm out. I'm going to get a job with a salary and benefits. I'm tired of chasing this rabbit as a
Right.
freelance, right?
Yeah.
You want to do it? Do it." So that's what I did. I mean, I kind of took a gamble and thought, all right, I'm going to launch my business and I'm going to try to go back into the photojournalism thing, but also try to go after some of the contract work. And at that point, I had pretty much given up on the music business. I did get work in the music business where I was hired by bands to do work for them. That's kind of the
Mhm.
goal for every music photographer, is to either like go on a tour. I did
For
it
sure.
locally. And then with the cycling industry, with Lance kind of imploding, there was nothing there. I think I have one friend who still has successfully, and he's done like Tour de France, Tour of Italy, still travels the world 300 days a year doing professional cycling photos. But I mean, it's high level, and he is one of the best in the business, and he's one of the nicest guys in the world. But like,
Nice.
every time I see him, I say, "You look like you're homeless." And he goes, "Well, basically, I am. I'm on the road 300 plus days a year. But even now, it's
Wow.
like the team, So cycling, I kind of knew that wasn't, yeah, and like I said, I still run this team. I will still pop out to a couple races because as the guy that runs social media and marketing and sponsorship, I can take photos that I can then provide to our sponsors that I know are high quality photos, but I'll
Right.
strategically, like my wife is like, "I do not want you every weekend going out and standing on the corner of these races, right? There's nothing, it's not worth it." And it's a lot of work. So I will go to a few races a year. We do a team event every year. I get photos, I put them on my hard drive and I bank them. And I dole them out to our sponsors. With the music stuff, it's just something that I kind of gave up. So that, in a long circuit. That is kind of how I got to where
That's
this
great though.
started.
It's such a great story of passion and perseverance and really being curious. Like
Yep.
you're talking about you know, asking other photographers and people,
Mhm.
how do I do this?
Yes.
And learning from their lessons is it's perfect. And you know,
Everybody, talk. You know, the one thing I have told, and I have a colleague that has told me in the last few many years. You know, if there's one thing you can do, Scott, is like if somebody reaches out to you on Facebook or Instagram, be a mentor. Right? I don't have
mm,
all the answers. I know what I did, and I know what worked and what didn't. But at the same time, I've run into photographers that are not very nice,
yeah,
and that strangely, as strange as it sounds, it's mostly in aviation. In the music stuff, if I was standing at a show and I have one photographer in particular that I'm thinking about, but if I was standing at a show and I hadn't shot that band and they used various kinds of lighting and special effects and pyro and explosion stuff, I could say to him like, "Hey, what settings do you use?" And he would tell me, right?
mhm,
And it was like, with cycling with this guy that I mentioned earlier, or some of the other guys that we used to hang out at all the races. I'd say, hey, look, where do you stand to get the best shots on the course? Or what settings do you you know, that turned into a couple of them saying, hey, we have this gig, we can't do it. Do you want to take it? Paid gig, go take it. We're busy. Those in the aviation thing, it's actually the opposite, which is a whole different conversation. But the one thing that I say is like, if somebody were to say to me, "I like the photo, how did you take it?" Here you go.
mhm,
And I I wish I could say it was a little different in aviation, but I haven't found that. I don't know why.
right.
I don't know what that's about. But yeah, it was kind of a mix of, I've done a couple other interviews when my book got published. I was fortunate enough to do a couple aviation related podcasts. And the big takeaway that I've said on all of these is again, and I mentioned this a few minutes ago, as much as I love aviation like the next person, and as much as I love photography and cameras, and I'm kind of a nerd. I like all the tech stuff about cameras. Um, I also understood from working with my dad and working out there, like you have to be professional and you have to treat it like a business. If you're dealing with the military and there are gatekeepers at every step of the way, they're gonna say no. That's what they do. You can't be a jerk. You can be privately annoyed, but you have to be professional. Treat it like a business first. And I feel that same way with like other photographers. Like if somebody else wants to try to publish the next book on naval aviation, I'm going to help them. I know what I
Right,
went through to do it and it wasn't fun. And I'm honest with them and I'm like, if you want to go through what I went through, by all means, but here's the steps you need to do it. And I just,
right,
not a lot of people are like that. I'm not saying it's just me. Not a lot of the photographers that I know are like that. But,
right.
it never was, and I've said this before and I'll say it again. You can love airplanes as much as the next person. But if you show up and you're just oogling the airplane, oh my God, or I got access, you can't, you have to think a little differently.
Mhm,
And it always has been my takeaway is how if you want to be a hobbyist photographer and go to air shows, that is fantastic. There's nothing wrong with that. But the questions I get asked, like, how do you get published? How did you get access here? How did you do this? Like, number one thing, you need to be a professional. You need to treat it like a business first. Forget that there's an airplane there. Doesn't matter what's in front of you, what you're trying to get to. It's business first, professionalism. And then on top of that, like, ask other photographers. If they say go to hell, then move on to the next one. They're not all
mhm,
gonna be that way, but if they do, move on to the next one. If you get a no from this unit, they don't want you, "Hey, we don't want it, we don't want this," move on to something else, but keep asking questions. I mean, you have to. I mean, it was
mhm.
like you said, the curiosity part, it was just like, "Hey, I have this magazine, I see these photos. How is that person getting into your airplane?" "I don't know, but I'll find out for you." Or, like I said, I stumbled into 2 people that are like, "Yeah, we know. We know how to do that." You know? And it got exponentially harder, obviously, like I said earlier. If going from a helicopter to saying, well, I want to go fly in the back of an F-18 is a completely different layer
Right.
and layer and layer of approvals and the amount of no's that come before a yes. And that's the other part with, and I'm sure you've seen it with the other photographers that you've talked to or any business you're involved with. You're going to get told no most of the time.
Yeah.
And sometimes you have to accept no. You just do. And there may be good reasons and there may be not. I can tell you in my career in the last 15 years, the amount of Department of Defense public affairs officers that have said no to me where the reasons are ridiculous
Mm.
are more than the ones that say no for a legitimate reason, like, oh, we're going to be deployed when you're asking to come. That's legitimate, right? You're going to be in Iraq. Nothing or we're preparing to deploy, so there's reasons we can't have you out covering our unit for security reasons because the stuff we're training. But like I've mentioned this many times to other photographers, my biggest pet peeve again, I'm trying to help, right? I'm trying to tell your story. I'm trying to promote the military for the next 15-year-old that I was that wants to join, that wants to see what it's like behind the wall, the fence, whatever you want to call it. A day in the life of um Maverick is a great movie, but it's not accurate. So people
Right.
like me and other people, I'm not saying I'm the only one, but people like me that do this are here to tell your story. When I am told we can't fly you or we can't do it because let's say one of the excuses I hear all the time is if we do it for you, we're going to have to do it for everybody. Okay, I hear it all the time. Um, that sets me off. That is where I will get not aggressive, but I'll say, okay, let's have this conversation over the phone. Here's my conversation. I'm not special and I'm not better than anybody else. But if I send you a request with a letter from a magazine that says they're endorsing my work and they're going to publish my work, so it's an official letter of intent, which is the requirement that you have. Plus, I send you the link to my website. Again, not saying I'm special, but you can clearly see that with my background, having worked for the Air Force, after I left the Air Force and I started my own business, by the way, I also had a 3-year contract working for the Navy, so part time, but as a Navy photographer at Point Magoo. So, like, if you got a request from somebody who has a Facebook page where they just post a lot of airplane photos, again, nothing wrong with that, but they're said, can I come out for the day? Oh, can I fly in your airplane? And then you get mine. I think with your training as a public affairs officer, you can easily delineate the two and put your eggs into this basket to put the paperwork in to start that process of getting it approved. But to just flat out say, no, we can't do it, because then every photographer under the sun that loves airplanes is going to call and say, well, you flew Scott into your airplane. Why won't you fly me? Well, that's your job that's your side of the fence, right? To be the
Right.
professional that says there are certain people we do this for because it is of value to the military or law enforcement. I mean, LAPD, it took me years to get into flying with LAPD, but like, they're very media shy because they're
Right.
always embroiled in some kind of scandal here. But their air unit isn't necessarily, and they kind of saw the value, but it took years from the bureaucrat side of LAPD to say, no, we don't want anybody around, right? And as soon as I say, like, look, let's get past that part of the conversation. Let me explain to you what I'm going to do for you, where it's going to end up, and what value you can create from that. I don't want to hear like, well, then I'm worried that the next photographer is going to come and but for those photographers, like I said to you earlier, if somebody called me and said, "How did you get in with LAPD?" I would tell them.
Right.
I
Exactly.
had
It's about
y-
sharing. Yeah.
yeah. I had a real estate agent because I help my wife sometimes, and we were at a meeting 2 weeks ago, and this guy's one of the biggest, busiest guys out here in Thousand Oaks. And he sat with me and he was talking to a group of us, and he's like, if you want to use my marketing materials, take them. If you want me to tell you what to write in an email, call me. He goes, I mean, he knows, like, you're not my competition. I can help
Right.
you. I have my clients, you have yours. So when people reach out to me, I'm like, you want my help? I'll help you. I've had a few people ask me, hey, how did you publish your book? I've connected them with my publisher, even. I'm like, here, I'll call the vice president of my publishing company and connect you. You want to talk to this public affairs officer in the Navy? Here you go. Like, it, it,
Nice.
that's, I don't know if you see that in other parts of photography that you deal with, but I mean, like, I'm not always of the like, again, if at this point, after doing this for so many years, I can understand what the no's mean. So like when it's a no, and like I said, if I understand why, like I'll let it go. At this point, because I've actually backed out of a lot of this stuff, I'm not doing it as much as I used to. I have a particular magazine publishing group that I mentioned to you up in Canada that I work with a bit. I do some contract work for Boeing, but I'm not actively going out and trying to do this anymore. There's a few projects that I'll get involved with, and I mean, again, I'm like, I'm 52 years old, and I'm not trying to create any sort of like aura of myself, but I'm like, I don't want to fight this battle anymore.
Right.
When people ask me when my book came out, like, what's your next book? I'm like, I have no desire, no matter I had some high level support from the naval aviation community. And that is a huge reason, probably the only reason my book ever got done. But the other side, the more bureaucratic side of things, was painful, and
Mm,
was painful for a long, like a year. And then even after my book was done, it was painful again. So like I tell people flat out, here's where I'm at. I love the Navy and I love naval aviation. And I've been asked by 3 or 4 people to do this, this, and this. And I'll say, you know what? I would be willing to, if all of the approvals, you guys do all that. You do all the legwork. I don't, I will step in. I will have every meeting you want me to be at, every email, but I do not want to ask for permission. I worked my ass off to do what I did, and there should be some level of like, okay, we know he's a known commodity. Let's do this. So like, occasionally I get asked, "Do you want to go work with this Air Force unit?" I'm like, because I know, especially now with social media, and especially with some of the changes of like influencers and stuff, like there's just it's changed dramatically. So
right.
it's not that I'm just kind of just don't want to fight the battle as much as I used to.
Fair
And
enough.
that's one of the questions you asked in the email you had sent about, is about changes. That is one of the biggest changes I've seen, is just it's different but the same. They still say no a lot, but it's for different reasons. Now they're
Yeah.
chasing likes and views
Mm,
as opposed to substance, and I don't understand that. I think there's a
yeah.
time and place for both, and there's some great people doing like aviation centric YouTube or podcasts. There are. I mean, I'm not, I get messages all the time like, how is that person getting access? I'm like, they're doing good work, and they're telling the story that needs to be told, whether you like it or not.
Yeah.
This isn't personal. It's like, what are they doing? What's the end goal? But there's a lot of, as I said earlier too, a lot of just, nothing wrong with this, but just people taking photos and nothing else.
Right.
And when I've discussed it with, like, say, military people, I'm like, what else? Like, you need your story told. A photo is great. Nobody hates a good photo. But that photo on Instagram lasts all of what, 10 seconds? There
If that,
has
yeah.
to be, and you might think print magazines are dying or digital magazines, whatever. Whatever the medium that you're using, you guys still need your stories told. I don't care if it's, like I said, it's a law enforcement agency or military or whatever. They seem to kind of gravitate one way and think that's it. And that's where I've seen the change. It's like, everybody else doesn't matter. We're going this way now. And I'm like, in 2 years, you're going to be like, uh-oh, we need this now.
Right.
So, I've been working on this one project with the Air Force, and I won't name names, but if they're listening, they're going to know what it is. Um, this is a unit I worked with early in my career when nobody else would work with them. And I, as sort of like, because I'm slowing down with this stuff, they're the guy that was running the unit called me and he's like, "It would be kind of cool. Like, you should work with us again." And I said, "Yeah, what would be neat about it is it'd be like sort of a circular, like, you were one of the first military units that I flew with. And as I'm winding this career down, I'm not done. I'm just saying this, like, not pursuing it as actively. Like, it'd be cool to be like, circle back and talk about that. 2 years. 2 years to fly in an aircraft that I've flown in dozens and dozens of times in my career. It's not about that. I don't care whether I fly in the aircraft or not, but it is a more effective way to tell the story. It's more
Right.
because of my background. I could go stand on a runway and take photos of these airplanes, and that's great. But because of my background, and I'm like, because of what I can do, you need the air-to-air photos. You need that to elevate the narrative. And it's been 2 years of people sitting behind desks somewhere just kind of saying no. And we don't know why. Even the people out at the unit are like, we don't know why. And I'm like, whatever, then don't do it.
Yeah,
I'll
exactly.
if you want me to sign something, I'll sign it. If you need me to send an email explaining myself again, I'll send it. But like, if they just keep saying no because we don't do this or well, blah blah blah, I'm like, don't, like I keep telling them, like, don't fight City Hall. I don't want
Yeah,
your superiors getting mad at you because you keep pushing something that really at the end of the day isn't that important. I'm also like real like it's important to tell your story, but it's not your mission, right?
yeah,
So
exactly.
so yeah, it's definitely changed a lot in the last